So welcome to this last panel. Now we turn our perspective around and take the viewpoint of the rest, as it were, the rest 27. And we have on our panel two political scientists, one lawyer and an economist, which come up with views of what might happen, is likely to happen. And I'm happy to give the floor immediately to Douglas Weber.
Thank you, Adrienne. I'm very pleased to be here. It's hard to imagine on this very mild and sunny and benign autumn afternoon in Florence that exactly 50 years ago to the day, the Arno was running something like 3 meters high through the middle of the city. We have been much luckier with the weather for our conference this year. I'm supposed to talk about the prospects of disintegration following the Brexit referendum vote. I like to differentiate between 3 dimensions of disintegration. One, sectoral, which means basically the adoption and implementation of fewer common policies. Vertical disintegration, which means a shift in the balance of power away from the central or supranational organs of the EU, and mainly in Brussels, towards the member states. And what I describe as horizontal disintegration, which involves basically member states, existing members deciding to leave the EU, as in the current case. One can also make other distinctions between perhaps voluntary disintegration and coercive disintegration, which would be the case, for example, if Greece were at some stage to be expelled from the Eurozone, or indeed between partial disintegration or complete disintegration. For example, Greece might be forced out of the Eurozone. That would be a case of partial sectoral disintegration for me, and Brexit is a case of partial horizontal disintegration. I think I'm meant to talk this afternoon really about the question whether or not the Brexit vote will give rise to some kind of contagion or domino effect in the EU, and indeed already there are some scholars and some political scientists who have suggested that might be the case. In fact, if one goes back a decade to the book written by our colleague Stefano Bartolini here and at the EUI, he talked in Restructuring Europe about the possibility of the EU breaking up in a phase of mass mobilization like the Ottoman, Habsburg, and Soviet empires. He would probably find himself confirmed by what is currently happening in the UK. And I know, for example, again, a graduate of this establishment, Simon Hicks at the LSE, has outlined a kind of worst-case scenario in which Brexit is followed by the secession of Denmark, Sweden, and Austria from the EU, eventually leading to the disintegration of the entire EU. I shouldn't say, though, that he thought this was the most likely scenario, but a possible, in his case, in his view, the worst-case scenario. And indeed, of course, it may be interesting in principle to ask whether and at what point there is some kind of tipping point at which the secession of one additional state would provoke an accelerating and unstoppable centrifugal process of European disintegration. However, so far as Brexit is concerned, I am very doubtful. Whether should it indeed take place, Brexit would create such, or bring about such a process. And I think for about 3, to some extent, interrelated reasons. Firstly, as we saw this morning in John Curtis's presentation, the UK, I think among the 28 member states, is uniquely Eurosceptic for a whole host of geographical, historical, and other kinds of reasons. Secondly, the secession process of the UK from the EU has been taking place step by step, gradually, over a period of at least 25 years. If one bears in mind, Britain never joined the Schengen area, never adopted the single currency, opted out of the fiscal compact, negotiated their separate membership deal under David Cameron before the fateful referendum. And thirdly, because particularly during the Cameron premiership, I think the UK had become quite rapidly increasingly isolated from other member states in the EU. The immediate effect of the Brexit vote, in fact, interesting, going by opinion polls, was the reverse of that expected by those people who talked about a possible contagion or domino effect. Rather, it had a kind of centripetal effect. The proportion of respondents in other member states saying that they're in favour of leaving the EU fell dramatically in the weeks following Brexit. So there was a kind of solidarisation effect of the Brexit vote, if you like, as if people actually on the European continent said to themselves, if the British are doing this, it must be a very bad idea. So, in the longer term, of course, the impact of Brexit on the likelihood of further disintegration will depend on a number of factors which we've discussed, I think, at length already in the session today. One will be what will be the eventual terms of Brexit, and secondly, what will be the perceived economic and other impacts of Brexit and how these things are perceived by citizens in the other member states. From what I've heard around the table during the course of today, it's hard to believe that these impacts and these effects and consequences will encourage citizens of other member states to contemplate the secession of their states from the European Union. Rather, the reverse is likely to be the case. Nonetheless, for reasons unrelated to Brexit, but perhaps connected to the Eurozone crisis, to the refugee crisis, or other potential future crises, secession and disintegration may nonetheless occur in the EU. And since there's not much to say about Brexit and contagion and domino effects, let me generate discussion, even at the risk of exposing myself to ridicule, make some brief remarks about which other member states might be tempted more than others to emulate the British example. No one has suggested seriously, to my knowledge so far, that any of the following member states might secede from the EU. This is a list of 14. Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, Ireland, of which we have spoken already, Spain, Portugal, Malta, the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria. No one has suggested so far, I think, that these member states might think about leaving the EU. For the other 13, I have developed what I call a secession propensity index, which I hope I can call up here. Yes. What I've tried to do with this index is to try to go beyond sort of opinion polls, to offer kind of snapshots of public opinion in the different member states, and whose findings actually fluctuate wildly over time. One example, for Italy, earlier this year, a couple of polls suggested as many as 48 or 46% of Italians might opt to leave the EU given the chance in a referendum. After the Brexit vote, this fell to 26%, roughly by 50%. What I try to do in the index that I've constructed here is distinguish between what I describe as, or would describe as, the structural and the conjunctural variables that might determine this secession propensity. Conjunctural variables, as you see here, the extent of voting for Eurosceptic or anti-European parties and whether they take part in the governments of their country, or the recent or current economic conjuncture. Structural variables, for me, the size of the country, how close it is in political terms to the UK, is it dependent on the EU for financial support, is it close, relatively speaking, to Russia, and therefore does it see Russia as a potential threat to its security and therefore seek safety in numbers. Otherwise, you can see all these things here, and you can also see, I think, very quickly that the member states on this index with the highest probability of emulating Brexit are firstly Italy, followed by Finland, and then probably by France, which in terms of economic performance is really right on the average for the member states of the EU. Italian politics might prove particularly exciting to watch over the next 18 months because, as you probably all know, there is going to be a constitutional reform referendum in December, 4th of December, and Parliament for elected latest by May 2018. And although a week is a long time in politics, at the moment these opinion polls are suggesting 3 things. Firstly, Prime Minister Renzi will lose the referendum. Secondly, in the next parliamentary elections, no party is likely to win more than 40% of the vote in the first round and therefore won't get a majority of parliamentary seats at that stage. And in a prospective second round runoff, Renzi's Democratic Party will lose to the Five Star Movement, which wants to stage a popular referendum on Italian membership of the Eurozone. It is possible, therefore, I fear, that to imagine or to envisage a scenario under which Italy, at some stage in the next few years, decides to secede from the Eurozone. And I think if this scenario were to materialize, I'm not predicting it, nor do I think it's necessarily more likely than not, but I think it's conceivable. If it would occur, this would probably have a much more dramatic impact on the EU and its future than would Brexit. Thank you very much.
And on that optimistic note, so I'm not sure if I should say what I had thought about saying as my first statement after this prediction. But the first point I actually wanted to make about Brexit was, if there is something positive that at least I take immediately from Brexit is that it reaffirms the voluntary character of the process of European integration. I think this point hasn't been stressed and needs to be stressed. Oh, you are going to stress it. But I'm making this point not just a matter of principle, but actually in terms of how this should guide how the European Union behaves in post-Brexit referendum, including in the negotiations with the UK. I think it would be extremely negative if it will come across for the other member states as that they have no alternative but to stay in the European Union. I think that the argument for the European Union needs to be done in a positive way and not in a way that it's very negative from the perspective of saying, well, actually, it will be disaster, absolute disaster if you don't stay. And I think that Brexit and the referendum on Brexit has also taught us that we need to develop a positive argument for the European Union, not only a negative one. In this same light, I actually also believe that the door for non-Brexit should stay open. But that the question should be one for the British people to decide, as simple as that. I think the European Union should leave the door open, but should in no way stress this point or try to indicate that it wants to push for this solution. But I think we should not exclude that possibility for one simple reason, that is actually a democratic reason in the UK itself. It is that whatever alternative to the European Union itself will need, in my view, to have some form of democratic legitimation in the UK, be it through a second referendum or any other alternative to be decided. But let's assume that the European Union stays with 27. By the way, just one parenthesis. Also, I wasn't asked to talk about the consequences of Brexit itself or the deal on Brexit, but I wanted to make a specific point and a specific proposal that, in my view, might be interesting also for the European Union at 27 itself. That is, I believe that the EU should seriously consider to grant European Union citizenship to all UK residents in the European Union after Brexit, all those that will be resident at that time. I think the only alternative to that will be to give them the right to reside in the member states where they are, but that doesn't give them the full scope of the rights that they currently have. And even in terms of a possible negotiation with respect to EU citizens that will be in the UK, I think the best parallel and the best solution will be actually for British citizens that are in the European Union to remain EU citizens. In my view, this will also be an interesting development. Some people might agree with it, some people might not agree with it, in terms of European Union citizenship, by partly decoupling it from national citizenship. That adds its risks, but it also has its potential interest, and I think it will be, if there is an opportunity to explore that, it will be this one. So, if we think about what the European Union will be and how the European Union should react after Brexit with 27 member states, the first thing that we hear, and we hear it very often, is that even in the previous presentation to a large extent, is that the reasons for the Brexit vote are not unique to the United Kingdom. Many of them are now currently shared in other member states. They have to do with consequences of integration, globalization, but also European integration. They have to do with this idea that you have two different sets of citizens, those that are mobile and those that are not mobile, and that the project of European integration has been conceived, constructed, and developed mostly focusing on mobile citizens and not taking into account non-mobile citizens. It has to do with developments on national democracy, but in many respects there are indeed many reasons that explain the Brexit vote that explain dissatisfaction and risks of disintegration and secession indeed in other member states. However, there are two problems with this in terms of drawing conclusions from this to what the European Union should do with 27 member states. The first one is that a lot of these problems, I don't believe they are causal. They are emotional, they explain the vote, but the European Union is not the origin of a lot of these problems, in fact. And I think the people in the United Kingdom will realize that. I'm not sure the extent to which Bernard will talk about this, but I think that a lot of the things against which people reacted in the United Kingdom are a consequence of broader processes of integration that the European Union can help regulate instead of being considered as the cause of those problems. What we have now is a challenge. That is the fact that we are increasingly interdependent beyond our states. This generates the need for politics to regulate that interdependence beyond our states, and we haven't found an appropriate, adequate, and then socially acceptable mechanism of regulating that interdependence. But I think the European Union is perhaps the best thing that we have to try to generate that instrument. It's not because we will get rid of the European Union that we will get rid of that interdependence. And therefore, a lot of the social and economic problems and sentiments that to which Brexit reacted will not go away simply because you eliminate the European Union. The second problem to draw conclusions from what determined the vote to what the European Union should do is that even if the abstract emotional reasons will be shared that explain Brexit are also shared in many other member states, that is different from those reasons converting themselves into similar preferences by those citizens on what the European Union should do. When I hear the general statement saying, well, see, finally, now the Brexit is a wake-up call, finally European politicians should do what European citizens want them to do. The problem is that European citizens in different member states want their leaders to do with respect to the European Union and want the European Union to be substantially different things. This is the real problem that we have now. Those concerns, the preferences from EU citizens in different member states are in some instances radically different on crucial issues. And the fundamental problem of the Union is that in fact it has not developed the politics necessary to reconcile those radically different preferences. So to say it needs to answer to the claims of its citizens, it's no solution whatsoever. What we need is to find a way, a political way, to reconcile those preferences. To a large extent, the dissatisfaction of citizens with the European Union regards its substantive policies, its outcomes. And there's a lot that, in order for the Union to be effective, that I could propose with respect to the substantive policies of the Union. But the problem is that that cannot be done because of its politics. So a lot of its dissatisfaction has to do with outcomes, but a lot of the difficulty to deal with that comes from input, from the difficulty of generating that political space to arbitrate and reconcile in a manner that is acceptable by all those opposing preferences. And this creates a kind of self-reinforcing vicious cycle. Because the Union is ineffective in dealing with the euro, is ineffective in dealing with refugees, it becomes even more unpopular. And because it becomes more unpopular and it's susceptible to more manipulation in terms of internal politics, becomes the scapegoat for national politicians. It's much easier to be popular in the short political term if you are against Europe, because Europe doesn't provide the answer, is not effective, doesn't answer to the problem of the refugees, doesn't answer to the social costs of the euro, doesn't answer to the discipline necessary on the euro depending on the member states. Because of all that, then the political incentives for the actions that citizens give for the action of their national political leaders at the European level lead them to make the substantive policies even more difficult to agree. And we are in this almost permanent, vicious and self-reinforcing cycle. I could talk about what I believe could be that grand bargaining. That might require reinforcing certain policies, nationalizing others, might require changes on the EU budget, but also on certain policies, might require changes on own resources, but both, I don't have the time. And I just want to conclude, therefore, with another point, that is the following. I think that in order for that grand bargaining to be possible, for a long period of time, I thought, and I believe, and I'm still doubtful about that maybe it will be impossible at the level of the high politics to do that. And therefore, treaty amendments are impossible, kind of constitutional changes are impossible. Let's try to do it infra-constitutional politics, if you want, or even low-level politics. I'm increasingly doubtful that it will work that way. In fact, it has not worked that way so far. And I'm increasingly, and since I'm very skeptical that it will work that way, I don't know the extent to which one should not try a big constitutional moment, one won't. That could somehow be linked to a new narrative of the European Union, one narrative that will link those changes in policies to the Union reshaping the social contract in areas where states are no longer able to enforce their own social contracts. And linking, for example, own resources with taxation of multinational companies, things like what happened with Apple and all kinds of things, to try to get, at the same time, resources for the European Union, but also, at the same time, a narrative for the European Union with respect to the citizens. If that is so, the question is, how can we do treaty amendments today in the European Union? A few years ago, I made a proposal with Bruce Ackerman, and I conclude representing that proposal. That was what we call the South African model for the European Union. I explain it very briefly. In South Africa, the constitution after apartheid was introduced by first having an agreement on a set of basic principles between the different racial communities, and then by a constitutional convention drafting the constitution, and the specific constitution then being reviewed in light of those set of principles by the Constitutional Court. What we suggested for the European Union is the possibility to have a similar two-stage process. An agreement on principles, on fundamental principles, that will require unanimous ratification, parliament or referendum, depending on member states, and will be linked to the choice of representatives by that state that will then negotiate the treaty on the basis of such principles. The final treaty itself will not require unanimous agreement, might not even require referendum ratification, but it will require an assessment of the compatibility of that treaty with the basic principles agreed, and that assessment will be done by an ad hoc court composed of the chief justices of the presidents of the Supreme Courts of all now the 27 member states. It is an outside-the-box perspective to try to have a treatment amendment, and I've concluded.
Thanks. So I'll talk a little bit about trade. I wasn't really aware that I was supposed to take the EU 27 perspective, but I will do that as I go along. So if you think about what was discussed in the run-up to Brexit, the why, in terms of where the trade agenda entered into the equation, there's really two dimensions that we've already talked about that quite a bit. Is one, take back control of the border, and of course that's mostly migration, but the same thing applies to anything that crosses the border. And secondly is to kind of regain sovereignty over regulation. All right, so those are the two kind of elements, and in this, under that heading of the regulation, we have trade policy itself, the common commercial policy, but we also have a lot of action with respect to product and process standards, which are very pervasive and have been expanding and growing very rapidly. And of course, there's a budget dimension to this as well in terms of money going into the common agricultural policy, which feeds into trade policy, which is in itself a very complicated arena. And at the same time, implicitly, if not explicitly, the notion was we will retain access to the European Union, both for goods and for services in terms of actually being able to trade. Now, if you ask, how does this compute, and that will be my main kind of focus in the intervention, in terms of how does that compute for the UK and what are the implications of that for the EU 27? I mean, the title of my talk, I kind of paraphrase Dr. Fox, who goes on repeatedly about the glorious joys of free trade. So he has this very 19th century view of the good old days when, Britain ruled the waves and we had free trade. And if you think about, what that actually might mean, it's very hard to actually conceive of how the UK could actually get better access to markets than it has today, right? So in a sense, we already have the type of free trade he claims to want. Yes, there are a few sectoral pockets where we still have tariffs in place, but mostly we live in a world where trade restrictions and trade costs and trade barriers, however you define them, are all a function of regulation, right? So it's a function either of explicit regulation of access to markets, and country A has different regulations from country B. And this regulatory heterogeneity is really the main source of trade costs today, right? And there's a huge amount of economic literature on this in terms of what the sources of costs are, how you might get them down, trade facilitation, and so forth. And what all of that really maps into is different versions of the single market, right? So we really have to kind of focus on dealing with the regulatory heterogeneity that exists. And we've, I think, collectively been quite successful at doing that, and that's been reflected in huge cross-hauling of foreign direct investment between the UK and the EU, but also more globally. We have supply chain type of production techniques, which of course all of the firms, the large investing firms in the United Kingdom that make anything, import a very large share of their value added and export it back either to the EU or to other markets, but mostly to the EU. So if you think about we go back to a unilateral free trade policy, if that really is the objective, it's simply not going to work. In a sense, you are going to have to deal with this regulatory agenda, so inherently you're going to have to deal with other jurisdictions, whether that's the UK or other jurisdictions. So that's really the first point. We need to satisfy the regulatory requirements that exist in the European Union. That will apply to the UK, that applies to China, that applies to Russia. And I think one of the more interesting features of the discussion that has been taking place both before and after the vote is this notion, well, the rest of the world actually has very good access to the European Union, so why can't that apply to us? So I think here it really is an issue of disentangling what it means to be a member of the European Union in terms of being able to trade goods and services versus what you might be able to do in the context of the types of free trade agreements that the European Union negotiates with third countries. I think one kind of aside on the regulatory front is if you ask, what is the problem with European regulation when it comes to products, whether they're goods or services? I just came from a meeting in Minsk where there was a big debate between the European Commission official and the Russian Deputy Prime Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, where the EU representative was arguing, we have a different system of standardization and how we actually do this than you guys have. Whereupon the deputy minister said, well, may I give you a fact, which is that 80% of our standards are EU standards. And why are they EU standards? Because EU standards are international standards. Right, so there is a notion that a lot of this is actually happening internationally already, and a lot of the regulators that are actually regulating these different sectors are writing standards in a multilateral context, of which the European Union, of course, is an important player, but it's not EU specific. Now, if you think about the objectives of what Mr. Fox or Dr. Fox is trying to achieve, on the one hand, he's thinking about unilateral free trade, right? So what can we do to reduce our own barriers to trade and through that process, generate growth, productivity improvements, and so forth. Now here, all of the analysis that has been done on this is in terms of what would it actually, to what extent would the costs associated with getting out of the European Union and living in a hard Brexit world be offset through unilateral trade liberalization and negotiating trade agreements with the rest of the world? You know, that doesn't really add up to a hill of beans, if I can put it very scientifically, in terms of what that would do in terms of generating real income for UK citizens. So there's a little bit that can be done in terms of that unilateral free trade agenda. There's a little bit more that can be done through negotiating free trade agreements with other countries. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of these barriers have already disappeared, right? So in terms of the way the world economy works, the average tariff today is on the order of 2-3%. Virtually all of the inputs that are used by firms which are involved in this process of global value chain-based production, they don't pay tariffs. So again, it's a world that has disappeared, and it's very much the agenda, as I mentioned before, is about regulation. Now, insofar as the ability of the UK to negotiate new trade agreements with third parties, it's not all that clear, actually, that the UK is all that much liberal than the European Union member states. Right, so if we take away the tariff, where we have to then kind of find out if the UK leaves the common, if the UK leaves the customs union, we have to find out what kind of a tariff structure the UK will actually put in place. But if you look at one area where the UK currently has sovereignty to define its own trade policy, which is in the area of services, there is this perception that they're more liberal than the European Union. If you look at the data that the OECD has put together in terms of services trade restrictiveness across the different OECD countries, including all the European member states, the UK on average is a little bit more liberal, but it's hugely more protectionist in particular sectors, right? So there's a lot, what that suggests is there's a very live political economy, of course, of trade policy in the UK, which doesn't necessarily support this notion we're going to move to free trade, right? So I think that's something to take into account in terms of how you assess the ability of the United Kingdom down the road to actually negotiate trade agreements. And of course, they're going to have a lot less market power than the EU has. There are these serious capacity constraints that everybody realizes. There are headhunters now very actively trying to recruit people to actually work for the Department of International Trade because there aren't enough Brits to do this, apparently. And of course, ultimately, the ability to negotiate trade agreements are going to be a function of what the deal is with the EU. Nobody knows that, so this is all kind of speculating into the future. Now, let me then turn to the EU 27, kind of what the implications for the rest of Europe are going to be. And I think here, clearly, one element is going to be we're going to lose a large economy. Right, so if we think about the European Union's ability to negotiate with the rest of the world, to engage with China, to engage with other large traders, simply we're going to have less market power, and we're going to lose also a voice that is on average going to be more promoting liberal trade policies than some of the other European member states. I think the really big question for the EU 27, and here I'm going to echo I think a bit what Miguel was also saying and what others have said today, is really this notion of what are the trade relationships going to be with the EU 27 and the United Kingdom. And I think here there is this discussion about hard versus soft Brexit, for me sounds really bizarre, especially the hard Brexit side, because I cannot conceive of how can we, EU 27, treat a country that has been part of the EU for 40 years as if, now you're China, now you're Russia, we're going to give you the worst possible treatment. To me, if that happens, and I agree with Miguel, that would be the worst possible outcome, I think, for the EU in terms of signaling, in terms of how we actually were to do this. So in that perspective, remarks by Mr. Juncker, remarks by President Hollande along these lines, I think have been very unfortunate. So what I will assume in my remaining few minutes is that rationality will prevail and that there will be some mechanism of transitional periods agreed with the EU in terms of working out what the trade relationship is going to be post-Brexit, and that the UK will also be smart enough to go to the WTO and ask for a waiver, with support hopefully from the European Union, because a lot of what is going to happen between the UK and the EU 27 post-Brexit is going to violate all kinds of provisions in the WTO, so therefore you want to safeguard yourself from potential disputes and conflicts there. Now, what might a soft Brexit then look like on the trade front? And I think here it's important to take seriously the arguments that have been made by many in the United Kingdom that, you know, you have to start off from the basis that the rest of the world actually manages to trade with the EU 28 or 27 quite well. That's not just an issue of goods, that's also an issue of services. So why can't we replicate that? And that really boils down to a large extent, issues associated with rules of origin, right? So if the United Kingdom goes out of the customs union and moves towards free trade relationships with the EU, we have to agree on rules of origin. Now, there's quite a big econometric literature that suggests that rules of origin imply trade costs of anywhere between 1% and 5%. But at the same time, I also think that given new technologies, given the fact that we have systems in place already that are used in the European Economic Area arrangement, I don't see that as being a huge negative. That is all manageable. So I think the real action here pertains to the issue of free movement, which is of course the political issue, but it's also a trade issue because if we're talking about trade and services, we're talking about movement of people. Right? So I think one of the key challenges for the EU 27 is, can we actually have a discussion which is not purely political and says the single market is take it or leave it, all the 4 freedoms or no freedoms, and to say, okay, in some of these areas what we're really talking about is a necessity for people to move, but it's associated with the provision of services. Right, so I think that's where I would argue a lot of the discussions are going to have to be. Now, there have been some kind of suggestions made to actually go sectoral, right? So this car case, the Nissan case, which was discussed at length in the papers, you know, how do you deal with this issue? Well, maybe we should pick and choose particular sectors that matter to us and safeguard them. Right? I don't see how that is going to work if we're talking about preferential access on the tariff side, because that's a blatant violation of the WTO when you're going to have 50 countries immediately come banging down the door and saying we want the same treatment. So that suggests you really need to move towards a situation where you have full free trade, where it applies to all products. But I think on the services front, in particular, but also goods, we're going to have to move toward a situation which was discussed by Derek, mentioned earlier today, where effectively, because it is all about regulation, it's going to be about, you know, where can we agree that there is mutual recognition, where is there equivalence, where do we trust the UK systems of regulation enough so that their goods and services can actually flow into the UK. Now, I realize that all of this is going to be driven by politics, not by economics. But I think there is obviously, almost by definition, the day after Brexit, nothing has changed, right? So in that case, they meet all of the requirements. So the real issue here is a dynamic one, right? So what do you do in the future? How does that work? And I will end just with one point on this. There is nothing unique or specific about the United Kingdom in this regard. This is something the Union has been struggling with now for at least 10, 15 years. We've seen it in the context of deep and comprehensive free trade agreements. We've seen it in the context of Canada, TTIP, and so forth. Increasingly, as this is about regulation and how you deal with regulatory heterogeneity, the Union has to come up with a way of how do you actually manage these types of conflicts, differences, right? And I think that has something that we need to do in any event. So I would argue that really Brexit is an opportunity to actually rethink what do we mean with deep integration with countries that don't really want to become EU members, right? So clearly EU membership has to be something distinct and we need to define what that is. But at the same time, I think when it comes to having access to the single market, there have to be, and there are different mechanisms that have already been put in place that allow firms to actually know what the rules are that apply to them. And I think a lot of that will revolve around this notion of equivalence of regulatory regimes, which in fact is something that has been and is being discussed between the European Union and the United States in the context of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now, of course, those negotiations are really flat on their back because of, again, the politics, investment, etc. But the technical dimensions of what has been discussed and what is ongoing on the regulatory front, which is really what the single market to a large extent is about, it's there, right? So I think there is something to build on there if there is a political will to actually be constructive as opposed to punitive in terms of how we treat the United Kingdom. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for this kind of de-dramatizing the problem and ending on a rather optimistic note of feasibility. Right? Brigid, your turn.
Okay, I have called what I'm about to say membership matters, and I end by saying membership must matter. So what do I mean by this? Membership of the European Union is not like membership of any other quasi-international organization. It's different. It has an impact on state identity and on the identities of individuals. It imposes rights and also obligations. What does it mean to be transformed from a nation state into a member state? I think firstly we need to think about the language. So when at a European Council all the heads of government come together to be photographed, and they are, and it's a growing group, it's always called the family photograph. That matters, the family photograph. Secondly, when one refers to another member state in the EU, one refers to our European partners. That sense of partnership, they're not just other states, they are partners in a collective endeavour. The third thing I would say is that there are very strong markers of belonging that this system has generated over time. The first is obviously the flag. Now, you see more often than not, although not in Denmark, most heads of a European member state will always speak formally with the two flags, the national flag and the European flag. And we even have lots of examples of David Cameron speaking with the backdrop of both flags. We also, those of us who are citizens of EU member states, we carry in our pockets those symbols of identity like the passport, the driving license, the health passport, and those in the euro, of course, carry another very material symbol of membership of this collective. But to be a member state also adds layers and levels and arenas to the contained public policy making system of your member state, of your state. You've got to accept that you encase your constitutional system in another constitutional system, i.e. the EU. You've to accept that there is another legal system and another source of law. You have to embed your system of public policy, and as we know, most areas of public policy now have a European dimension to greater or lesser extent, that this shared competence, it's very fuzzy, it's very complex, but the reach of the depth and reach of the EU has greatly strengthened since the Single European Act. We also know that states, when they agree to join the EU, open up to a shared future. The view is that you are not just a member of the EU that is, but you are open to whatever that EU will become, of course negotiated over time. And that sense of the EU always in the process of becoming means that for every state, you're involved in something over which you have voice, but not total control, because of course no member state can control the system, including Germany. So there's a mutual vulnerability in the system. You open to each other. If you become a member state of the EU, you open to each other. And it's precisely, in my view, that mutual vulnerability that means that instead of having a 36-page constitution, which is what could be possible if it were a nation state, that you have this god-awful series of treaties, because the EU has to specify always not just what it does, but how it does it, to protect against the mutual vulnerability that comes from being a member state of the EU. But of course, there's also, in sovereignty terms, that acceptance that you're pooling and sharing. Every member state explains their membership to itself, both in terms of the official narrative, but also the stories that are told as to why you joined the EU and why it's in your interest to remain in the EU. And if you look at the narratives from different member states, states draw on the historical narrative. So Portugal at the beginning would always reference the glorious days of Portuguese when Portugal was a world power, etc. Oh, not only the past, and of course, a great, and of course, the historical, what is available to you historically differs. So it's easier for some countries to draw on their historical experience in terms of the fit with the EU than it is for others. In other words, why is it that of all those complex parts of the two islands we discussed in the last session, why is it that it's the Republic of Ireland has the easiest of fit with the system? It's very obvious. If you were a 19th century Irish nationalist dreaming of what kind of international system would suit a putative free Ireland, then it would be one that was not dominated by the United Kingdom. So in other words, the historical narrative is very easy to play in an Irish context, but obviously not just in Ireland. And then of course there's the economic, the security and the political. And Douglas, I was very struck by your list, and that in your potential contagion index that Finland scored so highly. But of course, what you disregarded was Russia. So I would say that Finland is not one of those countries that would come anywhere close to considering leaving the European Union, nor would I say the Baltics precisely for that. But of course, the United Kingdom was a country for whom the historical there just wasn't quite the same historical texture available and experience available to make this case. And as we know and heard this morning, both the British elite, and it's, again, even the fact that I use the term British elite says how complicated all of this is, because of course the state that is a member state of the EU is the United Kingdom, and Brexit. In fact, Brexit can't even happen because it's the UK is going to leave in the end. But both the elite in London, but also predominantly the English, but not just the English, really never felt that at home with this system from the very beginning. It's an outlier and has been from the very beginning. So then the question is, if this country, as it has, this state, opted for exit over voice and loyalty, what does that mean for membership and what does it mean for the system? And I would say, firstly, the dark side of the moon, and I'm conscious I'm not referring to the economy. The dark side of the moon is it introduces a contingency to the membership of all countries. In other words, there is a demonstration effect. There will be a historical event. The United Kingdom will leave. This will reverse the magnetic attraction that the EU has exercised for most European countries in the post-war period, not all. And it could embolden those forces who are not just skeptical or critical of the EU, but deeply phobic about the project. In other words, those people for whom someone like Marine Le Pen, who can equate the EU with the Soviet Union. So there are real dangers here on the contingency of membership. On the other hand, and this is the bright side of the moon, and this refers to what Miguel has already said, if taken in terms of the reverse, the EU can say to itself that what this proves, it proves something deeply fundamental about the DNA of this institution, and that is that it is voluntary, and that secession is provided for and in a peaceful way. And if we look through history, secession from polities has usually been conflict-based rather than, there have been some velvet divorces, but not that many. So in other words, there is a story the EU can tell itself, the 27, that by peacefully letting the United Kingdom go, not that there's any European army available to do much about it anyway, but that it proves that this is voluntary and that secession is part of the system. It can also, of course, there's another part of the EU DNA, and that is that it has particularly, not from the beginning, because in the end the inner six was a very small group of states, but from the time of the first enlargement, from the 1970s onwards, this is a system that has had to deal with more and more diversity, deep diversity, and therefore more and more differentiation. And it has allowed for differentiation within the union by policy regime, opt-outs, opt-ins, and has provisions for enhanced cooperation. So within the union and of course with the euro, non-membership, membership. So there is an acceptance within the union that it's not one size fits all. There's also acceptance that with relations with the world beyond the union, that one side doesn't fit all. You have a country like Norway that I would describe as an outsider-insider, whereas perhaps the United Kingdom for the last at least 20 to 30 years has been an insider-outsider. It has allowed for multiple bilateralism with Switzerland, and of course we've talked this morning about all the different varieties of trade agreements. So this is a system that knows differentiation and deals with differentiation and offers differentiation. And so then the question is, what kind of differentiation will the United Kingdom ask for, and what kind of differentiation will this system be capable of delivering at this stage? And there I think that's less clear, because this is not dealing with a third country, it's dealing with an exit, it's dealing with a shock to the system after the EU has been through since 2009 a series of very serious problems, the euro crisis, followed by the refugee crisis, followed by the deep volatility in the domestic politics of many states in Europe today. So the political capacity of this system is much weaker than it would have been prior to these crises. Not just that, but also the confidence in the EU in itself is much weaker, and you have challenger parties in many member states that combine anti-migration in anti-EU. And so that, and then on top of all of this, at this juncture, then this country comes and decides to hold a referendum that was national, but has immense consequences for the system and for the other member states. If the EU was about internalising externalities, then suddenly the externalities of the UK referendum are very dramatic indeed for many countries in Europe, but also for the system as a whole. So the question is, how will the political capacity be found to handle this? And handle it in a way that it can be at least mutually beneficial, or if not, that both sides can tolerate the outcome. I'm not sure we're into win-wins here, but that both sides, both the 27 and the UK, can live with the outcome. And there I think that's technically complex. It's not just politically complex. I think it's technically complex. And I think it's also politically complex. And I think it will matter enormously how the UK, the tone with which the UK approaches this. I think they really need to give Boris Johnson a training in diplomacy, because it just doesn't wash to be told that Brexit will be brilliant and Brexit will be a wonderful success. And you're then wanting, as foreign minister, to negotiate with other countries to give you a good deal. So the tone will matter. The tone will matter enormously, and also the ask. And what I heard today is not only is the United Kingdom, it is struggling to put in place process to handle this, and it's struggling to put in place a policy direction. And it's struggling on both. And then it's also struggling with how to handle this internally in the United Kingdom, a country that is a kingdom of many unions. So there is a lot of contingency here that will only emerge over the next 6 months. But then, as happens always in the EU, things go from high politics. The European Council will meet once Article 50 has been sent. They will meet, they'll give general direction, and then it'll be over to the Commission to start the technicals. So this is going to happen very quickly. And my concern at the moment is, it's not clear to me that within the United Kingdom system, that there is the clarity that will be required to make that ask, to make sure that it doesn't then in turn, because if the ask is too ambiguous, then the system, the EU system, will have great difficulty in dealing with it. And I'll end simply by saying, I started by saying membership matters, and I will end by saying membership must matter. Because if the other 27 remain, as it appears to me they will, committed to the benefits of membership, but also the costs, the limits and the vulnerabilities, then that must make a distinction between, however, the distinction between being a member state and being a former member state must be real. It must make a difference. Or else there is a systemic question for the EU of what glue will hold the 27 together, given all of the strains that Douglas spoke about. So I'll leave it.